The 12 tribes of Israel. Heaven offers me everything. Today we're going to have a discussion on the coronavirus, a pestilence, and pestilence is a judgment of the Most High. 2 Ezra 15:49. I will send plagues upon thee, widowhood, poverty, famine, sword, and pestilence, to waste thy houses with destruction and death. Isaiah 29 verses 5 and 6. Moreover, the multitude of thy strangers shall be like small dust, and the multitude of the terrible ones, the wicked ones, shall be as chaff that passeth away. Yea, it shall be at an instant suddenly. Thou shalt be visited of the Lord of hosts, armies, with thunder and with earthquake, and great noise, with storm and tempest, and the flame of devouring fire. First, we're going to have a discussion of the pestilence that is influenza and the deaths in the United States, the facts. In the box you see highlighted is hospitalizations and death. The summaries of deaths due to influenza or the flu over a 10-year period using an uncertainty interval. An uncertainty interval refers to confidence interval, the difference between the two being only philosophical rather than mathematical. Therefore, these numbers are not factual numbers. Using this guess interval, the deaths are relatively small compared to the total population of over 300 million in the U.S. More to follow on the worldwide estimates. Here we see the estimated influenza disease burden in the United States. These are also estimates, essentially a guess, of flu effects, non-death related, and estimates of death using uncertainty interval. An uncertainty interval refers to the confidence interval, the difference between the two being only philosophical rather than mathematical. Below that, we see the estimate of influenza diseases burden dealing with symptomatic illnesses and medical visits. These estimates are the number of people in the population affected by symptoms of the flu and estimates of the population that sought medical relief or medication for flu symptoms using uncertainty interval. An uncertainty interval refers to the confidence interval, the difference between the two being philosophical rather than mathematical. Next, we'll look at the U.S. influenza deaths by year from 2010 to 2019. To the right, you see where the information was retrieved for the U.S. populations from 2010 to 2019. In the table at top left, we see those years, the number of estimated deaths, the U.S. population, and you also see a calculation of the percentage of the population. Using the figures of the uncertainty interval, we can calculate the percentage of U.S. population that was estimated to have died due to influenza virus, the flu. All of the percentages of the population are less than 1% of the population, 1% being 3,282,395 people. 10% would be 32,823,952. The above table shows that the estimated 34,000 deaths is only 1/100% of the population. The 61,000 estimate of 2017 to 2018 is still under 0.02% of the population. Next, we consider the COVID-19 data. We will combine both the flu and COVID-19 estimates together to get a percentage of the population, both of the U.S. and the world population, since there has been media propagation of a pandemic. Spoiler alert, we will see the actual infrequency of the effects of these viruses and question the need for a vaccine. Vaccines. This is another issue in and of itself. So, taking a look at the deaths of COVID-19 in the United States as of December 8th, 2020, we see that there was an estimated 285,000 deaths, the U.S. population being 328,239,523. The percentage of the population is 0.08%. The world has heard the questionability of the reporting of deaths. It seemed that there were no other forms of mortality outside of this particular virus. Now, even using the above uncertainty interval refers to the confidence interval, the difference between the two being only philosophical rather than mathematical. The percentage of deaths in the U.S. is still less than only 0.08%. An example of 1% would be 3,282,395. At right, we see how the statistics are gathered about this data for coronavirus. And it says that it changes rapidly and may differ by location. This data changes rapidly and might reflect some cases still being reported. Some areas may not have data because they haven't published the data or haven't done so recently. Because data availability differs by location, date ranges for 14-day data may start on different dates. It includes confirmed and probable cases. Total counts include both confirmed and probable cases in some locations. Probable cases are identified by public health officials and use criteria developed by government authorities. Next, it's constantly updated from resources around the world. Data comes from Wikipedia, government health ministries, the New York Times, and other authoritative sources as attributed. It may differ from other sites and sources. There are various sources that are tracking and aggregating coronavirus data. They update at different times and may have different ways of gathering data. And we see the worldwide COVID-19 estimated deaths as of December 12, 2020. There's an estimated 1.6 million deaths of the 7.8 billion people upon the earth. Commentary. To be clear, this presentation is not discounting that there are actual deaths related to this virus, nor a lack of empathy and sympathy for those families that have suffered a loss through the death of their loved ones. The assertion here is the danger of vaccines, vaccination, and how this science works against what the Most High uses for His judgment upon the earth, and there is a nation or people that is attempting to take the place of the Most High by saying in their minds that they will ascend into heaven, exalt His throne seat above the stars of the Most High. They will sit on top of the mount of His congregation in the sides of the north. They will ascend to the heights of the clouds, and that they would be like the Most High. This is from Isaiah chapter 14, verses 13 to 14. Considering the above research, there is no need for vaccination against either of these two respiratory infections. The percentages of the population affected by influenza and coronaviruses, 337,000 over a 10-year period, added to the 285,000 for the 2020 data, total 622,000 deaths. Together equals only 0.1896% of the population today. Contrast that with 1% again, being 3,282,395. As of the current worldwide population of 7.8 billion, the current uncertainty interval of 1.6 million deaths is only 0.000205% of the worldwide population. For example, in comparison, 1% of the population would be 78 million. 0.5% of the population would be 39 million. In fact, coronavirus is simply influenza virus renamed for its purported origin in China. For influenza is known as MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, in the Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, etc. region, and SARS, South Asian Respiratory Syndrome, in most East Asian countries, for example, China, Thailand, Singapore, Korea, etc. Influenza, a term originating from Europeans, is sort of an umbrella term for a host of respiratory infections. Respiratory infections being various parts of the lungs, upper, lower, or bronchial, etc. The Heathen or Gentiles, origins of the word influenza. This is taken from Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. Influenza at a glance. Where did influenza get its name? What exactly is the difference between seasonal and pandemic influenza? And what does the term pandemic mean? This page provides some answers. More information can be found throughout this online guide. The menu bar at left will help you find information quickly. On this page, influenza, the origin of the name, the invisible flu or seasonal influenza, the scary flu, pandemic influenza, a pandemic, Some think worldwide spread, others think disaster. What constitutes a pandemic? The World Health Organization's 6 phases. First, influenza, the origin of the name. Influenza earned its name from an Italian folk word that attributed colds, cough, and fever to the influence of the stars. Later, the term evolved into influenza del freddo, influence of the cold. The flu has appeared under various names through the years, including epidemic, catarrh, grippe, and sweating sickness. In the mid-17th century, New Englanders colorfully called the disease the Jolly Rant and the New Acquaintance. In England, it was called the knock-me-down fever. But the flu reaches much further back in time, historians believe, plaguing Greeks fighting in the Peloponnesian War in 430 BC and decimating Charlemagne's army in the late 8th century with the burning fever. The invisible flu, seasonal influenza. The flu is a contagious respiratory illness caused by influenza viruses. Seasonal influenza infects millions of people across the globe every year. It can cause mild to severe illness and at times can lead to death. Every year in the United States, on average, 5 to 20% of the population gets the flu. More than 200,000 people are hospitalized from flu-related complications. According to the CDC, about 36,000 people die from flu-related causes. Flu is a difficult topic because it confronts us all the time. Independent journalist Mary McKenna pointed out on New Hampshire Public Radio in September 2009, "We don't notice. It's just like the number of people who die in car crashes." Why do we get the flu over and over again? Because the influenza virus changes from year to year and over time becomes less recognizable to our immune system. Now the scary flu, the pandemic flu. Pandemic influenza is different from seasonal influenza in several ways. A pandemic emerges from an entirely new strain of the influenza virus against which many people have little or no immunity. Seasonal flu, on the other hand, emerges from slightly changed flu viruses against which many people have some immunity. Seasonal influenza strikes in the winter months. Pandemic influenza can strike at any time of the year. Pandemic influenza has the potential to affect almost every person in the world within a short time frame. This is why pandemics have the potential to scare. In the worst case scenario, people will die not only from complications of the disease, but also because hospitals are overcrowded, supplies of antivirals and antibiotics are not sufficient, and because there hasn't been enough time to make a vaccine. This is what spurs pandemic preparedness efforts. The economic and social impact of a milder pandemic is harder to determine and sometimes hotly debated. We know which high-risk groups are likely to suffer serious complications from seasonal flu. However, in a pandemic, the high-risk groups are not known, certainly not initially. In the early days of a pandemic, scientists and doctors struggle to determine who is most vulnerable as the disease spreads and kills. Knowing who is at a higher risk is important because resources, especially treatment and vaccine options, are limited in a pandemic, and more vulnerable groups are granted priority access to those resources. In addition, flu pandemics sometimes come in waves. The 1918 to 1919 Spanish flu came in 3 waves of increasing lethality. Within each wave, mortality appears to have been greater at the beginning of the wave compared to the latter. The question of what role one wave plays in creating or not creating immunity for the next wave is the subject of an intense scientific debate. A pandemic? Some think worldwide spread, others think disaster. Pandemic, from the Greek word for all and people, pandemos, is a technical term that refers to the spread of a disease across regions, while an epidemic is a greater than expected outbreak of a disease within a given population, region, and time period. A pandemic occurs when an epidemic sweeps the globe. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines pandemic as an outbreak of a disease occurring over a wider geographic area and affecting an exceptionally high portion of the population. The fact that the term refers only to the spread and not the severity of the disease causes considerable confusion in the early days of the 2019 H1N1 pandemic. For in public perception, many believe a pandemic can be nothing less than a major disaster. This is in part because officials have spent years preparing for a severe pandemic, not a mild one, and they have created support for their efforts by evoking images of the devastating 1918 to 1919 influenza pandemic. What constitutes a pandemic? The World Health Organization's 6 phases. In May 2009, the World Health Organization, WHO, was under pressure from some member states to change the definition of a pandemic. These countries argued that while the virus was clearly spreading to many parts of the world, the mild illness it caused in the vast majority of cases did not merit pandemic status. In the existing and in the end unchanged definition, a disease must meet the following conditions to be called a pandemic. 1. A new influenza virus subtype must emerge for which there is little or no human immunity. 2. It must infect humans and cause illness. 3. It must spread easily and sustainably among humans in at least 3 countries in at least 2 different WHO regions. In order to coordinate international outbreak surveillance and responses, the WHO uses a 6-phase model to describe the pandemic phases of an ongoing influenza outbreak. The pandemic influenza phases. Phase 1 to 3 is predominantly animal infections, few human infections. Phase 4, sustained human-to-human transmission. Phases 5 and 6 / pandemic, widespread human infection. Post-peak, possibility of recurrent events. Post-pandemic disease activity at seasonal levels. Briefly, Phase 5 is categorized by human-to-human spread of the virus into at least 2 countries in 1 WHO region. The declaration of Phase 5 is a strong signal that a pandemic is imminent and that the time available to finalize the organization, communication, and implementation of planned mitigation measures is short. Phase 6, the pandemic phase, is characterized by community-level outbreaks in at least 1 other country in a different WHO region, in addition to the criteria defined in Phase 5. Designation of this phase indicates that a global pandemic is underway. Again, these definitions of what constitutes a pandemic say nothing about severity. In May 2009, some critics argued that declaring a pandemic would frighten people even though the disease was mild. Others had different reasons to suggest changes. A pandemic definition that ignored severity may have been appropriate when only health officials were following WHO pronouncements, but since the spread of the bird flu, journalists and other parts of the public have been following its pronouncements too, argued risk consultant Peter Salmon on his website on May 23, 2009. The WHO shouldn't signal its highest level of concern about a virus that is still comparatively mild. My concern over the past week has been that the WHO would declare a pandemic, people would notice that nothing much had changed in their daily lives, and they'd conclude that the pandemic was no big deal. That's an outcome worth avoiding. On June 11, 2009, the World Health Organization officially declared a full-fledged pandemic with nearly 30,000 confirmed cases in 74 countries, by officially raising the pandemic alert from Phase 5 to 6. Story idea: even though the H1N1 pandemic had been declared, questions about the WHO phases remain, such as are they sufficient and who decides? Times' Brian Walsh also raised some good questions at the time for the journalists to ask, and these are the sources for that article from Harvard University. Now let's take a deeper understanding of vaccine and vaccination defined. The meanings and origins of words is important. Let us review that of the word vaccine. The foundation of language is documented by those who defined its language and origins. Lexico is Oxford University's dictionary. Cambridge University Press has its dictionary from which we can research changes and the meanings of words over time by what is called archaic meanings of such documented words. Etymology Online is another research tool for discovery of meanings and origins. 1. What is to occur naturally has been usurped. Looking at the definition of vaccine, we see it as a noun. The first part of the definition is a substance used to stimulate the production of antibodies and provide immunity against one or several diseases. Prepared from the causative agent of a disease, its products, or a synthetic substitute treated to act as an antigen without inducing the disease. The origin in the late 18th century from Latin vaccinus, from vacca or cow, because of the early use of the cowpox virus against smallpox. 2. Taken from animals and injected into people. Etymology Online gives a definition of vaccine. Matter used in vaccination, 1846, from French vaccin, noun use of adjective, from Latin vaccina, feminine of vaccinus, pertaining to a cow. See vaccination. 3. An attempt to go against the order of the Most High. The definition of vaccination in Etymology Online reads, 1800, used by British physician Edward Jenner, who lived from 1749 to 1823, for the technique he publicized of preventing smallpox by injecting people with a similar but much milder cowpox virus, variole vaccinae, from vaccine, pertaining to cows from cows, in 1798. From Latin vaccinus, from cows, from vacca, cow, a word of uncertain origin, a mild case of cowpox rendered one immune thereafter to smallpox. The use of the term for diseases other than smallpox is due to Pasteur, from the Oxford English Dictionary. The earlier 18th century method of smallpox protection in England was by a kind of inoculation against variolation, or variola, the medical Latin word for smallpox. There are two forms of smallpox, a mighty one that killed 2% or less of the people who got it, and a virulent form that had about a 30% mortality rate and typically left survivors with severe scarring and often blinded them. Those who got the minor form were noted to be immune thereafter to the worse. Doctors would deliberately infect healthy young patients with a local dose of the minor smallpox, usually resulting in a mild case of it at worst, to render them immune to the more deadly form. Jenner's method was safer as it involved no smallpox exposure. 4. Various meanings of the words demonstrate duality of purpose. The word cow it's a verb meaning to intimidate, daunt the fear or courage of. In 1600, probably from the Oxford English Dictionary, from the Old Norse kuga, meaning oppress, which is an unknown origin but perhaps has something to do with the Scandinavian forms of cow on the notion of easily herded. Related, cowed, cowing. And here we see a selection of reports on proven dangers of vaccines. The Guardian, polio outbreaks in Africa caused by mutation of strain in vaccine. The Logical Indian, fact check, were 496,000 children in India paralyzed between 2000 and 2017 from Bill Gates's polio vaccine. And Science Magazine, polio eradication program faces hard choices as in-game strategy falters. Commentary. The heathen or Gentiles are afraid of another occurrence, the likes of the 1918 to 1919 influenza pandemic that killed 20 to 50 million people, including some 675,000 Americans over a 3-year period. The heathen or Gentiles experienced that pestilence and do not want to revisit it again. This is why there's a panic whenever a respiratory infection manifests itself. They will continue to act in panic because the leaders, also known as the elite in this world, know that the Most High can and will do it again. The heathen or Gentiles are extremely watchful, as we are supposed to be, as stated by Mashiach, and this is to our shame and confusion if we aren't watchful. The heathen or Gentiles are watchful of everything. Coming from space with telescopes and space probes upon the earth via satellites, All forms of communications, visual, spoken, written, via media services, of people, the use of spies through clandestine means, and all those previously mentioned. We must remember that storms, famine, sword, and pestilence are from the Most High as judgments and admonition or correction. Think about the judgment of the 1918 to 1919 influenza pandemic. This country had killed untold millions of people in the preceding centuries, 1492, 1619, 1865, and this may have been the Most High's judgment upon Edom, Esau, Idumea, Bozrah, along with his confederacy, for what had been done upon the Most High's children, the children of Israel, an estimated 20 to 50 million people killed at his hand during the slave trade and subjugation in the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish influenza was nothing new. There was the Black Plague, the Black Death in Europe that peaked in the late 17th century to 1600s, but had been destroying all of Europe since the 1300s, wherein 25 to 50 million were killed. Notice that this is a second discovery of massive death of Europeans with this similar number. Let us review the history and notice the locations and populations affected by these pestilences. The Black Death fades, leaving half of Europe dead 1351. The plague spread significantly, begins to peter out, possibly thanks to quarantine efforts, causing the deaths of anywhere between 25 to 50 million people and leading to the massacres of 210 Jewish communities. All total, Europe had lost about 50% of its population. Notice in the box there, social distancing and quarantine were used in medieval times to fight the Black Death, 1351. With the Black Death considered safely behind them, the people of Europe faced a changed society. The combination of the massive death rate and the numbers of survivors fleeing their homes sends entrenched social and economic systems spiraling. It becomes easier to get work for better wages, and the average standard of living rises. With the feudal system dying, the aristocracy tries to pass laws preventing any further rise by the peasants, leading to upheaval and revolution in England and France. Significant losses within older intellectual communities brought on an unprecedented opportunity for new ideas and art concepts to take hold, directly leading to the Renaissance and a more youthful, enlightened period of human history. Here we see some depictions of the medieval Black Death at top right. It was airborne, scientists say. The same thing they say about coronavirus. Below that, we see the social distancing and quarantine were used in medieval times to fight the Black Death, same as today. And other scenes of Black Death below that. And below that, how 5 of history's worst pandemics finally ended. And bottom left, we see how the Black Death spread along the Silk Road, which was the trade road between European countries and Asia. And bottom right, how diseases spread. Ways people have tried to explain pandemics through history. And that's going to be covered here later. It's interesting. Google plagues in European history. When we look that up, we see the Black Death, also known as the pestilence, the great mortality, or the plague, was the deadliest pandemic recorded in human history. The Black Death resulted in the deaths of up to 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia and North Africa, peaking in Europe from 1347 to 1351, so over about a 4 or 5 year period. We saw 75 million to 200 million people die between Eurasia and Africa. Below that, we see under people also ask, how many plagues were there in Europe? There have been 3 great world pandemics of plague recorded in 541, 1347, and 1894 Common Era, each time causing devastating mortality of people and animals across nations and continents. On more than one occasion, plague irrevocably changed the social and economic fabric of society. And below that, we see what were the 3 plagues. There are 3 forms of plague in humans: bubonic plague, septicemic plague, and pneumonic plague. Commentary. This is extremely important to understand. Using vaccinations, the heathen or Gentiles are attempting to fight against what the Most High brings upon them in judgment and only he can stay or stop the judgment on his own accord. These pestilences do not stop because some man or woman created a substance from the innards of cows or any other animal and injected it into people to lessen the symptoms. Vaccines have only been in existence since approximately 1798 in the use of fighting against cow smallpox or cowpox. And consider what nation or people created this abomination, what the Most High hates. Make no mistake, vaccines are not a cure. No one seems to ask what happens in the bodies of those that get a vaccine but do not get the illness for which they were vaccinated. Research recombinant DNA. Quote, DNA that has been formed artificially by combining constituents of different organisms and is used to identify, map, and sequence genes and to determine their function. Recombinant DNA probes are employed in analyzing gene expression within individual cells and throughout the tissues of whole organisms, end quote. Also known as genetic modification or genetic engineering, which is trying to play God and attempt to fight against the Most High. What was done and what is being done is unlawful according to Scripture in Leviticus 19:28, Leviticus 3:13, Leviticus 17, Leviticus 4, verses 5 and 6. Whether the method works to lessen symptoms should not be the focus. Whether it is lawful to do or not to do is the matter at hand. For example, blood transfusions and organ transplants both involve exchange of blood. Cuttings of the flesh or examples of tattoos are unlawful. The blood, one of many innards of the herd or flock, were only to be sprinkled upon the altar for appropriate sacrifices. Injecting yourself with the innards of a cow or any other animal is an example of eating or ingesting, if you research its biblical definition. Remember that the pestilences of Egypt are prophesied to return in the last days, even over 20-fold. There were only 10 plagues upon Egypt passed in Exodus chapters 7 through 12, and it is prophesied that there will be 250 plagues in the last days from the Targums of Achilles cited below. These plagues are prophesied to fall upon the ruling nation or people before, during, and after the time of the Israelites' redemption and salvation. The scriptures identify the last ruling nation or people as 1. The hammer of the earth in Jeremiah 50 and 23. 2. The nation of people are spiritually Sodom and Egypt, Revelation 11 and 8. 3. The nation is known as Babylon and the daughter of Babylon, Micah 4:10, Isaiah 47 and 1, and Psalm 137 and 8, respectively. This nation of people is not centrally located, but resides on all continents of the earth, as they were prophesied to do. That is, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth, and as the dew of heaven from above, and by thy sword or weapons shalt thou live. The methods of influence include that nation of people either 1. Visit to influence, a method of getting into the land, 2. Reside, get agreement and remain in the land, or 3. Establish representatives, keeps access to the land. This is in Genesis 27 verses 38 to 40. The hammer of the earth is not alone in their conspiracy to control the earth. They are aided by other nations or peoples in confederacy or agreement, notably evident of the United Nations affiliated countries as a governmental/political entity, the Roman Catholic Church as the most influential religious entity, using all of the non-denominated and denominated Christian churches that are comprised of over an estimated 2.1 billion members. Espousing ecumenical worship, which is promoting or relating to unity among the world's Christian churches, also known as daughter churches. Through ecumenism, via the World Council of Churches and National Council of Churches, all denominations have signed agreements with the Roman Catholic Church. Catholic meaning universal. For the worship of whom? Surely not the Most High, the creator of heaven and earth, the God of power and king, ruler of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, Jacob, and all the called and chosen seed known as the Israelites, in Deuteronomy 1 and 8, Deuteronomy 4 and 37, Deuteronomy 10 and 15. Governments and religions are systems of control. Whether good or evil is determined by their fruit. And certainly they have done and will do both good and evil as manipulations on some level. To what latter end? Now we will continue to review a short history of pestilences upon the earth. There have been 6 documented devastating plagues. Take a look back at 6 of the most infamous outbreaks of the disease once known as the Great Mortality. This was written by Evan Andrews, updated August 22, 2018, originally from October 12, 2016. The Plague of Justinian. Here is a painting of the plague in Constantinople. Justinian, who lived from 482 to 565 AD, is often credited as the most influential Byzantine emperor, but his reign also coincided with one of the first well-documented outbreaks of plague. The pandemic is believed to have originated in Africa and then spread to Europe through infected rats on merchant ships. It reached the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, Turkey today, in 541 AD, and was soon claiming up to 10,000 lives per day. So many that unburied bodies were eventually stacked inside buildings or left in the open. According to the accounts by the ancient historian Procopius, the victims demonstrated many of the classic symptoms of bubonic plague, including sudden fever and swollen lymph nodes. Justinian himself was stricken and managed to recover, but over a third of Constantinople's residents were not so lucky. Even after it subsided in Byzantium, the plague continued to reappear in Europe, Africa, and Asia for several years, causing widespread famine and devastation. It is believed to have killed at least 25 million people, but the actual death toll may have been much higher. 2. The Black Death. A scene from the plague in Florence. In 1347, a virulent strain of plague invaded Europe from the east, most likely via Italian sailors returning home from Crimea. This Black Death would eventually spend half a decade tearing across the continent. The populations of whole towns were wiped out, and it was said that the living spent most of their time burying the dead in mass graves. We see death coming into our midst like black smoke, the Welsh poet wrote. A plague which cuts off the young, a rootless phantom that has no mercy or fair countenance. Medieval physicians tried to combat the disease using bloodletting, lancing, and other crude techniques, but with little understanding of its cause. Most fell back on the belief that it was a divine punishment for their sins. Some Christians even blamed it on the Jews. Now, these were the black Jews in that area at the time, and caused bloody pogroms. For example, the Inquisition against those black Jews. The Black Death finally subsided in the West around 1353, but not before it killed as many as 50 million people, more than half the population of Europe. While the pandemic left much of the continent in disarray, many historians also believe that the labor shortages it caused were a boon to lower class workers who saw increased economic and social mobility. 3. The Italian plague of 1629 to 31. A drawing of the Great Plague in Milan. Even after the Black Death ended, bubonic plague continued to sporadically rear its ugly head in Europe for several centuries. One of the most calamitous outbreaks began in 1629, when troops from the 30 Years' War carried the infection into the Italian city of Mantua. Over the next 2 years, the plague snaked its way across the countryside, striking the major cities of Verona, Milan, Venice, and Florence. In Milan and Venice, city authorities quarantined the sick in pest houses and burned their clothes and possessions to prevent the spread of infection. The Venetians even banished some of their plague victims to a pair of islands in a nearby lagoon. These harsh measures may have helped contain the scourge, but it killed some 280,000 people, including over half the residents of Verona. The Republic of Venice, meanwhile, lost nearly a third of its population of 140,000. Some scholars have since argued that the outbreak may have sapped the city-state's strength and led to its decline as a major player on the world stage. 4. The Great Plague of London, a drawing by William Blake of plague victims. Plague laid siege to the city of London several times during the 16th and 17th centuries, most famously between 1665 and 1666. The pestilence first arose in the suburb of St. Giles in the Fields, but it soon traveled into the cramped and filthy neighborhoods of the city proper. At its peak in September 1665, some 8,000 people were dying each week. The wealthy, including King Charles II, fled to the countryside, leaving the poor as the plague's main victims. Quote, "Never did so many husbands and wives die together," end quote, a reverend named Thomas Vincent wrote. Quote, "Never did so many parents carry their children with them to the grave," end quote. As the sickness spread, London's authorities tried to contain the infected by quarantining them in their homes, which were marked with a red cross. Somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 people eventually perished before the outbreak died down in 1666. Later that same year, London was visited by a second major tragedy when the Great Fire of 1666 torched much of its city center. 5. The Great Plague of Marseille, painting of Marseille during the plague. Western Europe's last outbreak of medieval plague began in 1720 when a mortal distemper seized the French port city of Marseille. The disease arrived on a merchant ship called the Grand Saint Antoine, which had picked up infected passengers during a journey to the Middle East. The vessel was quarantined, but its owner, who also happened to be Marseille's deputy mayor, convinced health officials to let him unload its cargo. Plague-carrying rat fleas soon spread across the city, sparking an epidemic. People died by the thousands, and the piles of bodies on the streets were so large that convicts were conscripted to dispose of them. In nearby Provence, plague walls were even built to try to contain the infection, but it still spilled over into southern France before finally disappearing in 1722. By then, it had killed roughly 100,000 people. 6. The Great Plague Pandemic. People in quarantine in Karachi during the outbreak. And Karachi is located in Pakistan. The first two major plague pandemics began with the plague of Justinian and the Black Death. The most recent, the so-called Third Pandemic, erupted in 1855 in the Chinese province of Yunnan. It reminds us of the coronavirus today, doesn't it? The disease traversed the globe over the next several decades, and by the beginning of the 20th century, infected rats traveling on steamships had carried it to 6 inhabited continents. The worldwide outbreak would eventually claim some 15 million lives before petering out in the 1950s. Most of the devastation took place in China and India, but there were also scattered cases from South America to San Francisco. Despite the heavy casualties, the third pandemic led to several breakthroughs in doctors' understanding of the bubonic plague. In 1894, a Hong Kong-based doctor named Andre Yersin identified Bacillus yersinia pestis as the cause of the disease. A few years later, another physician finally confirmed that bites from rat fleas were the main way the infection spread to humans. Here we see a timeline of plague over an extensive period of time, beginning with 3500 to 3000 BC. In 2018, a Swedish tomb was excavated and discovered to harbor evidence of Yersinia pestis within the interned human remains. The estimated date of the individual's death is correlated to a period of European history known as the Neolithic decline. The presence of plague in the remains is evidence for the plague as a potential cause of this event. 541 to 750 AD. The first plague pandemic spreads from Egypt to the Mediterranean, starting with the plague of Justinian and northwestern Europe. 1346 to 1840, the second plague pandemic spreads from China, questionable as it is today, to the Mediterranean Europe. The Black Death of 1346 to 1353 is considered to be unparalleled in human history. From 1347 to 1665, the Black Death is responsible for about 1 million deaths in Europe. 1866 to the 1960s, the third plague pandemic, which originated in China, results in about 2.2 million deaths. The plague spread to India and killed a total of 22.5 million people under the British rule. Heathen develops the first vaccine against bubonic plague. Antibiotic drugs are developed in the 1940s, which dramatically reduced the death rate from plague. 1950 to 2000. Plague cases are massively reduced during the second half of the 20th century. However, outbreaks would still occur, especially in developing countries. Between 1954 and 1997, human plague is reported in 38 countries, making the disease an emerging threat to human health. Also, between 1987 and 2001, 36,876 confirmed cases of plague with 2,847 deaths are reported to the World Health Organization. Recent years. In the 21st century, fewer than 200 people die of the plague worldwide each year, mainly due to a lack of treatment. Plague is considered to be endemic in 26 countries around the world, with most cases found in remote areas of Africa. The three most endemic countries are Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Peru. Here is an excerpt of the Targums in reference to Genesis 15:3 and verses 12 to 15, the key verse being verse 14. And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast not given a son, and behold, the manager of my house will be my heir. And when the sun was nearing to set, a deep sleep was thrown upon Abram, and behold, 4 kingdoms arose to enslave his children: terror, which is Babel; darkness, which is Madai; greatness, which is Javan; decline, which is Pharis, which is to fall and to have no uplifting, and from whence it is to be that the children of Israel will come up. And he said to Abram, knowing thou must know that thy sons shall dwell in a land not their own, because thou hast not believed, and they will subjugate and afflict them 400 years. And also that people whom they shall serve will I judge with 250 plagues, and afterwards they shall go forth into liberty with great riches. And thou shalt be gathered to thy fathers, thy soul shall rest in peace, and thou shalt be buried in a good old age. Terror, which is Babel, means Babel, which equals Babylon. Darkness, which is Madai, equals Medo-Persia. Greatness, which is Javan, equals Greece. And decline, which is Pharis, equals Rome. These are spiritually and historically documented nations or people to have existed and concurrently held Israelites in captivity. As it is in these last days, as we have been scattered into all nations or peoples of the earth. In Leviticus 26:33 it says, I will scatter you among the heathen, and draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate and your cities waste. In Deuteronomy 28:64, and the Lord shall scatter thee among all people from one end of the earth unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And Zechariah 17, verses 13 to 14. Therefore it is come to pass, that as he cried, and they would not hear, so they cried, and I would not hear, saith the Lord of hosts. But I scattered them with a whirlwind among all the nations whom they knew not. And Jeremiah chapter 30:11. For I am with thee, saith the Lord, to save thee. Though I will make a full end of all nations whither I have scattered thee, yet will I not make a full end of thee, but I will correct thee in measure, and will not leave thee altogether unpunished. In Revelations 2, verses 18 to 29, key verses 24 to 29, and unto the angel of the church in Thyatira write, These things saith the Son of God, who hath his eyes like unto a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass. I know thy works and charity and service, and faith, and thy patience, and thy works, and the last to be more than the first. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. I gave her space to repent of her fornication, and she repented not. Behold, I will cast her into a bed, them that commit adultery with her into great tribulation, except they repent of their deeds. And I will kill her children with death. And all the churches shall know that I am he which searches the reins and hearts or minds, and I will give upon every one of you according to your works. But unto you I say, and unto the rest in Thyatira, as many as have not this doctrine, and which have not known the depths of Satan, as they speak, I will put upon you none other burden, but that which ye have already hold fast till I come. And he that overcometh and keepeth my works until the end, to him will I give power over the nations, the heathen or Gentiles, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. As the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father. And I will give him the morning star. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. Churches includes the assembly of the Israelites, by definition. Now let's take a look at the media headlines. Genetic engineering could make the COVID-19 vaccine in months rather than years. Candidates are speeding towards human trials, by Charles Smith on June 1st, 2020. In brief, to quickly create potential vaccines against COVID-19, researchers are using genetic engineering rather than traditional methods, which can take years. 3 different techniques based on DNA and RNA molecules are speeding to human trials, but whether they will work or can be scaled up to millions of doses is unclear. Then we see in Vox, we see the picture there with the current president and a lab. The title reads, "A third of Americans might refuse a COVID-19 vaccine. How screwed are we?" There's still time to get this right. This was written by Brian Resnick on September 10th, 2020. And then looking at definitions, since we talked about rDNA, recombinant DNA, we see on a Google search, it says, what is recombinant DNA used for? Recombinant DNA is used to identify, map, and sequence genes and to determine their function. Recombinant DNA probes are employed in analyzing gene expression within individual cells and throughout the tissues of whole organisms. Below that, what does recombinant mean? 1. Relating to or exhibiting genetic recombination. Recombinant progeny, relating to or containing genetically engineered DNA. Produced by genetic engineering recombinant bovine cow growth hormone. Below that, how is recombinant DNA produced? Recombinant DNA or rDNA is made by combining DNA from 2 or more sources. DNA fragments are cut out of their normal position in the chromosome using restriction enzymes, also called restriction endonucleases, and then inserted into other chromosomes or DNA molecules using enzymes called ligases. And below that, is recombinant DNA safe? The first and best known technique is recombinant DNA or rDNA. It has been the subject of intense research and development during the past 10 years and has been shown to be safe when used in the laboratory. The first commercial applications have been approved, for instance, in human insulin, for those who have diabetes, phenylalanine, human growth hormone. We have to ask ourselves, why is the coronavirus vaccine free when all other vaccinations cost you or your medical insurance? As in the days of Noah. What is the recombinant DNA technology in the COVID vaccine? Recombinant DNA Genetic Engineering, written by Anthony J.F. Griffiths, Professor Emeritus of Botany, University of British Columbia, Vancouver, co-author of An Introduction to Genetic Analysis and others. Last updated, October 14, 2020. Alternative title, Recombinant DNA Technology. Recombinant DNA or rDNA, molecules of DNA from different species that are inserted into a host organism, people, to produce new genetic combinations. Again, to produce new genetic combinations that are of value to science, medicine, agriculture, and industry. Since the focus of all genetics is the gene, the fundamental goal of laboratory geneticists is to isolate, categorize, and manipulate genes. Read again. And manipulate genes Although it is relatively easy to isolate a sample of DNA from a collection of cells, finding a specific gene within this DNA sample can be compared to finding a needle in a haystack, which means they do not know what the effects will occur in the body. For instance, the mumps, measles, rubella vaccine was found to target black children more than red or so-called white children, infecting and affecting a large percentage of our male children, of which my family is a victim. And over to the right, the MMR Autism and Black Male Children study. The results were, when comparing cases and controls receiving the first MMR vaccine before and after 36 months of age, there was a statistically significant increase in autism cases, specifically among African American males who received their first MMR prior to 36 months. Relative risk for males in general and African American males were 1.69 and 3.36 respectively. So basically about twice as many times, nearly twice as much. Additionally, the African American males showed an odds ratio of 1.73, again, almost double, for autism cases in children receiving their first MMR vaccine prior to 24 months of age versus 24 months of age and thereafter. The conclusion of the study. The present study provides new epidemiological evidence showing that African American males receiving the MMR vaccine prior to 24 months of age or 36 months of age are more likely to receive an autism diagnosis. This article is from the National Institute of Health, NIH, but this article was retracted in August of 2014. And the title of that retraction reads, Expression of Concern, Measles, Mumps, Rubella Vaccination Timing, and Autism Among Young African Boys, a Reanalysis of CDC Data. So the original study was a study of CDC data. And it reads in an abstract, the publisher of this article has serious concerns about the validity of its conclusions because of the possible undeclared competing interests of the author and peer reviewers. The matter is undergoing investigation. In the meantime, readers are advised to treat the report conclusions of this study with caution. Further action will be taken, if appropriate, once our investigation is complete. And we haven't heard anything since about that one. Summary commentary and scriptures. One must consider that Europe is an area that we, the children of Israel, were also scattered. We eventually became the rulers of the land, but were in sin. Sin led to our subsequent oppression via expulsion and scattering upon the African continent by the Europeans, Spain, Portugal, and Great Britain. Before this, Arab oppressors scattered us during the Arab slave trade via Islamic domination throughout the African continent and into Eastern and Western Europe. The Arab slave trade of the 1600s to present, for example, in Libya and Mauritania, scattered us before the transatlantic slave trade of the 1400s to 1800s by the European oppressors. This is from a book, The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa, A Quest for Interreligious Dialogue, A Quest for Interreligious Dialogue and Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam. The home base of the greatest oppressors on the earth are from Europe, who have nearly complete control of the earth. The exception being the Arab nations because of their religion and the Chinese because of their covetousness or desire to be the next world power by subjugating the United States. There is the presence of European influence in Korea, South Korea. China is a major trade partner but not beholden to the Europeans as of yet. Recall the method used to subjugate Japan, the 2 atomic bombs. Now, there is a run on the continent of Africa by the more powerful nations or peoples. The host of Europeans, Chinese, and Russians, and a European outlier, this is likely simply deception since Esau, Edom, Idumea, Bozrah is extremely clever. The following selections of scripture is our faith, patience, hope, and comfort until we are redeemed and saved by our Father, the Most High, by His Son, Yahushua, our Savior. The legend, the text highlighted in green pertains to the Most High or Israel. The text highlighted in red pertains to the Heathen or Gentiles, the non-Israelites. And the verse in parentheses is a key verse. Psalm 2, key verse 1. Why do the heathen, non-Israelites rage, and the people, Israelites, imagine a vain or meaningless thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, the heathen or Gentile rulers position themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder, evidence that the Israelites had the heathen under subjection, and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision, or ridicule, or mockery. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath, and vex them in his sore displeasure. Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion, another name for Israel. I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I will give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Be wise now, therefore, O ye kings. Be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, Hamashiach, Messiah, and ye perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him, the Son. And Psalm 46, key verse 6. The Most High is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore will not we fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof, Selah. There is a river, the streams whereof shall make glad the city of the Most High, the holy place of the tabernacles of the Most High. The Most High is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. The Most High shall help her, and that right early. The heathen raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice, the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The Most High of Jacob is our refuge, Selah. Come, behold the works of the Most High, what desolations he hath made in the earth. He maketh wars to cease unto the end of the earth. He breaketh the bow, he cutteth the spear in sunder. He burneth the chariot in the fire. Be still and know that I am the Most High. I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The Most High of Jacob is our refuge, Selah. 12 tribes of Israel. Heaven offers me everything. Shalom and Berakah.